Hello, everybody. I am here to tell you today about a very small lab for a very big city. For the last 3 years and a half, more or less, I've been running Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which translates into Lab for the City, the experimental arm/creative think tank of the Mexico City government. So for these 3 years and a half, we've been traveling the entrails of government and trying to figure out how government can better tap into the talent that you can find in the city and within citizens. As you probably know, we're not alone. We are part of a family of laboratories worldwide. Though we all depend where we are in the specific government structure. I, for example, report to the mayor's office, and it also depends on the city that we're born and raised in. We definitely have something in common, which is an experimental ethos, because we have come to see that governments are stuck in an interesting conundrum. On one hand, we sometimes feel that governments are not privy to the best ideas, and they're not necessarily all that agile when reacting to reality. But on the other hand, as citizens, we expect, obviously, for governments to be very sure-footed. So that's actually where laboratories come in. They create a safe space for an experimentation where we can take risks, try out new ideas, bring in other people, and re-articulate continuously, depending on the challenges at hand. So at the lab in Mexico City, we have two main agendas. One of them is Civic Innovation, which basically means how can we start reimagining the way that government and civil society comes together to meet the challenges of the city. And the other one is Urban Creativity, which basically is how can the city in and of itself become that great traveling surface for ideas, that space where citizens actually can sink their hands into the city and feel that they have a space in public life. So this is Mexico City, which is a very interesting challenge, as I mentioned, for a little small lab. It is a city of paradoxes. Mexico is 22 million people on the metropolitan area, 9.5 million people city proper, but with a floating population that comes in every day of 6 million people, which is obviously an interesting challenge. On one hand, we are the 5th largest economy in Latin America, even taking into account national economies. But on the other hand, we also have the lowest minimum wage in all of Latin America. So basically, this is more or less the context which we work in. The Mexico City government is 260,000 people strong. We are 20 people strong, and this is my team, a motley crew. Half of my team comes from social sciences and political sciences, so everything from urban geographers, data analysts, civic tech experts, etc. And the other half comes from the creative fields, which is artists and designers and filmmakers and writers, historians, journalists. We even have a masked wrestler on the team, believe it or not. He was ousted by The Guardian as a public servant by day and superhero by night, protecting pedestrian rights, which is now I'm very openly blatant about just like how motley it gets at the lab. And one of the very first things that we tried to do when we started off was really epitomize this government that becomes open to civil society. So this is the rooftop of a 600-strong government building. And we were lucky enough to get this space, which is a 1,000-square-meter green rooftop that oversees the city center. And this is Laboratorio para la Ciudad. So we've made this little space into a place where citizens can come to a government building not only for services and complaints, but also for ideas and debates and for workshops, and basically have tried to create a vortex of international thought surrounding cities. One of the examples is what we call sesiones de azotea, which is rooftop sessions. And we've had everything from the mayor of Mexico City several times, most of the ministers working in small, tight groups with civil society, putting them together with activists and with foundations and people that usually don't have access to government. But we've also had the fortune of having amazing people visiting us, such as Perry Chen, who spent a month with us. He's the co-founder of Kickstarter. And the first thing that he did when he stepped down as CEO was spend a month with us, talking about not only crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, but also how can we put into play this citizen talent, this creative talent into the government and city structure. So we work with what we call our experiments, and today I'm actually going to tell you one about mobility, which go everything from small, urban, playful interventions that try to reinvent political languages and urban forms, but also wide-sweeping public agendas such as the Open City strategy for the Mexico City government, where we did everything from pass laws. This is the mayor of Mexico City, and Open City law that passed unanimously in Congress. And we also have hosted workshops with more than 3,000 civil servants on very specific agendas so that we can truly advance what we think is possible. Another way that we really think the government should start working is revisiting and revising all of the public policy that exists in terms of public participation. So we're both working with different ministries and trying to rethink and use different and novel platforms to make this possible. And we also host events. This, for example, is our data festival, where we had more than 1,000 people signing up for a 48-hour marathon, which is quite fantastic. And we also create different types of urban thermometers and digital platforms to gather citizens' ideas. Besides that, we also have an editorial arm, and we're continuously putting on conferences not only at the rooftop, but at larger venues. But one of the things that we've really tried to do is put those ideas into practice. So one of the latest things that we have going on is Mexico City is getting its own constitution, which is a very important step in terms of local autonomy. Mexico City local government is only 20 years old, and this will give Mexico City a lot of new rights and, as I mentioned, very interesting autonomy. And so we did a crowdsourcing experiment with change.org, and I am happy to say that we actually had more than 500,000 people participating in this platform, and nowadays it's actually the largest movement on change.org and was followed internationally. We've also been trying to figure out through these thermometers what is important to citizens, what are their pleasure points and their pain points, and really think about urban imaginaries. We had 42,000 people talking about this and what they thought was the future of the city. And this is actually feeding into our different projects. But we're not only interested in data, but also what happens when data meets the city streets. So we have several ongoing projects. One of them is bringing children into city government, if you will, into becoming decision makers along with us. Believe it or not, Mexico City on a metropolitan area has 4 million kids under age 14, which is more or less the size of Lebanon. And so we've actually been figuring out where are specific places in Mexico City that we gathered through through crossing data of segregation, marginalization, concentration of children, and are now working in very specific communities with the kids, but also figuring out how we can turn neighbors and small neighborhood stores, for example, into new types of civic spaces and have government work as a catalyzer and not only as a provider of services. So I want to give you an example today about how, in a certain sense, government can use citizen talent and really articulate political will to social energy to solve challenges. One of our latest experiments was Mapaton. So I'll talk a little bit about mobility in Mexico City. As I mentioned, 22 million people in a metropolitan area is not necessarily an easy number to move around. Less than 30% of our population actually uses a private car. Our subway moves more or less about 5 million people a day. And these little buses here, which we call microbuses, actually move 70% of those trips. So that's 14 million individual rides a day that are moving in these buses. So what is the challenge? We have no data. We have absolutely no idea what is happening on the ground. Mexico City grew from having 3 million people in the 50s to having these 22 million people that I mentioned nowadays. So how does government go about actually mapping out and figuring out what is happening on the ground? First of all, definitely to drive public policy. Like, how can we make decisions when we don't know how and where and when 70% of the population is moving, but also as a citizen, as a user, because if you are ever in Mexico City, basically what you have to do if you want to get from one point into another in one of these buses is ask 5 people and then either average out or see who you trust the most, and then just like take a wild guess about what is going to get you to your place. So basically, how did we solve this? The very first thing that we needed to do was put together a brain. So this brain is not only composed of government, but also of civil society, which we find very useful in terms of how do you bridge these government experts with novel ideas, with younger people, with other experts working outside of government. And we started talking about what we needed and what could be helpful. And we came up with this idea, an experiment. We had absolutely no idea if it was going to work or not, which is why the lab becomes useful, not only convening the working group, but also creating, as I mentioned, the safe space for experimentation. And we decided that what we would do is create a citywide game, and we would ask the people to help us map out the city. So we knew that there had been smaller efforts, such, for example, in Nairobi, that had asked volunteers to help them map the Matuk system. But this was a much smaller venture, and besides, there's not enough volunteers that we could actually pull in and have the 1,400 routes in Mexico City and the 30,000 microbuses that exist mapped correctly. So we decided to give points from mapping from point A to point B, which is no easy feat because we found out things like, for example, the longest route actually is 9 hours and a half long and goes through 2 states besides Mexico City, which is slightly insane. So people willing to play really had to be of the adventurous sort. And we'd make a citywide contest. We created an app where you did not need to use your data to actually map, but you could go offline. With GPS, it would map the different points, and since we did know point A and point B on the trajectory, then you would start getting points every time you completed this game. To our absolutely huge surprise, we had 4,000 people participating. This is almost 700 teams, and I'm really happy to say that in 2 weeks' time, we were able to map the equivalent of more than a year and a half of a mapping effort that would have been insanely expensive in terms of, in terms of a consultation process, and it's more or less the equivalent to a turn and a half around the globe. This is the mayor presenting our first map. So Mexico City now has an open data set. Under GTFS, so now a lot of apps are actually pulling the information, and quite a few foundations, including the Centro Mario Molina that's run by one of our Nobel laureates, is actually using this data, working with government. So it's been very interesting to see how quickly the data gets into motion once it's out there. And the interesting thing, so this is Laboratorio de Datos, where we host all of the data sets that the lab has been opening before they go over to the official data portal of the Mexico City government. And this is the team, not the 4,000 of them, but the winners, the ones that were there for the ceremony with the mayor. And the very interesting thing is starting to figure out, why will people participate? In this age of mistrust, in this age of Brexit, and this age of walls and of Colombian peace processes, why do citizens want to help out government? Why will they engage? Why and how can we create better strategies for public participation and meet people where their interests are? And one of the things that we've seen is this is talking a lot less about government and talking a lot more about society and about cities, because there's also another interesting paradox. Even though voting is on a downslide, as you well know internationally, mistrust towards institutions is also at an all-time high. In a certain sense, there's also an increased interest, at the very least in Mexico City, of people wanting to engage with the city and to really be part of this public life. I actually think there's a hunger to be part of the public life if one can speak in the correct languages and, as I mentioned, meet people where they already are. So I'm going to show you a video of one of the winners, and he explains, I think, better than I could, why he participated and why these processes could be important, thinking forward about governance and other forms of participatory processes, which are, of course, especially in a megalopolis of 22 million people, still very much in process of experimentation. Video, please.
Yo me enteré del mapatón por las redes sociales. En Facebook, navegando, pues vi un artículo, entonces di clic, leí y pues me interesó bastante, de inmediato bajé la aplicación. Yo soy una de esas personas que viaja bastante en el transporte colectivo, entonces a la hora de ver la iniciativa, pues dije, esto me va a servir. Los participantes descargan una aplicación y mapean rutas de transporte colectivo concesionado para posteriormente mandar una base de datos a los servidores y tener un registro de todas estas rutas. Lo primero que yo hago pues es ir a platicar con el chofer. Como estamos en la base, no hay ningún problema de que interfiera con su atención al vehículo. Entonces llego de inmediato, le informo sobre el mapatón y pido permiso para tomar una fotografía a su letrero del vehículo. Más que nada esto para poder identificar las rutas. Tienes que hacer completo el recorrido para que sepan precisamente por dónde se mete, las rutas que toma, algún desvío, demás cosas. Ahorita sobrepasé los 15 recorridos, creo que tengo 17 recorridos actualmente. Todos los recorridos han sido bastante tranquilos. Con el mapatón pues vi una oportunidad para poder conocer varias partes. Estas rutas de Chapultepec, todo lo que es el norte, yo no había pasado por aquí. Me agrada bastante que estén trabajando en equipo, tanto el gobierno como la ciudadanía. Digo, si tú estás formando parte de la ciudadanía, puedes hacer algo para cambiar esta percepción. Ahora sí que, siendo parte del pueblo, ayudar al pueblo.
50% of Mexico City's citizens are under age 30. I will leave you with a question is, how can we start making government as exciting as the cities they are housed for the new generation that is actually, we feel, hungry to participate if they find the right means, the right mechanisms, and we start speaking their language. Thank you so much.